So we'll start with 3 ohms. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. So, Hari Om everyone. My name is Shankar. I will be filling in for Viveki today. So, today's topic, which we'll be taking up, is going beyond bullying. And, I'm sure this is a very relevant topic for many of us. Either we've experienced in the past or know people who are, victims to bullying. And, unfortunately, through, social media and other various networking platforms, it seems like this issue is becoming more and more prominent in our culture and society today. So it's a very, pressing issue in our culture. And so I would just like to share a few thoughts on this topic from the perspective of Vedanta in our Shastras. So, our Shastras, we have very extreme and overt examples of bullies, right? Ravana, Hiranyakashipu, Kamsa. And one thing which we notice, which is common amongst all of them, is there's a very deep-rooted insecurity, that they feel the need to put others down for the sake of their own self-worth, their own self-fulfillment, to make themselves feel bigger. So the question is, how do we deal with these type of people? How do we interact with them? How do we overcome the sorrow which they cause? And when I was thinking about it, there's a very powerful part of a verse from Bhagavatam, which it says, "Kripaya bhujitam dukkam," which means overcome the sorrow caused by other beings through compassion. And that's a very, very powerful statement. And when you think about it, it means try to be empathetic with the people who are causing us sorrow, and realize that all these actions are really just a manifestation and an expression of their own insecurities, their own problems which they're facing in their own lives. And if we can try and be more in tune with that, put ourselves in their shoes a little bit more, it'll help us realize that it really doesn't have anything to do with me in particular, or these people in particular. It's more just we just happen to be an outlet for these bullies to express their own insecurities, their own problems in their own lives. But we find that many of us and a lot of other people, it's hard to do that, especially in the face of extreme sorrow and the feeling of not being accepted and being singled out. So how do we get the strength to be able to do that, to invoke empathy and compassion for the people who are causing us sorrow? And if we look at some of the examples in our Shastra, like again Bhagavan Krishna, Bhagavan Rama, we realize that these people who are totally beyond the realm of being put down and being subject to the sorrow caused by these bullies, they have, they're very self-fulfilled. They don't depend on anybody else's opinion for their own sense of self-worth and self-fulfillment. And, especially in today's, social media culture, where we're really conditioned to depend on other people for our own sense of fulfillment, external validation. Like even the liking system in Facebook or Instagram, where, anything that we say has no relevance or no importance until we get a certain amount of likes or a certain amount of follows or anything like that. So there's this very, subtle culture which is conditioning us to really depend on others for our own sense of fulfillment and self-worth. So I think it seems like it's of utmost importance to try and, before we can deal with this, first try and find a sense of inner security and inner purpose. And really the only way to do that, and I think this is the perspective of Vedanta, is we have to have a very clear set of principles which we live our life in accordance with. Our sense of worth should be derived from our ability to, live up to these principles which we value. So, for example, Rama, Bhagavan Rama, he was such a stalwart of, upholding Dharma and living dharmically, and he would uncompromisingly stay true to his word. And so when you have that sense of dedication to these inner principles, your sense of security and inner peace is totally unshakable. It's not derived from anything external. And I think that's really the only sustainable way for us to be able to overcome these external sources of sorrow. And, even to take it, a step further, Vedanta it's very uncompromising in its, in saying that all sorrow that we experience in our lives, it's our responsibility to overcome that, right? It says that it's never our circumstances or surroundings or other people's responsibility to change for our own sense of fulfillment. So that, and if we think about it, that's such a profound way to live, to think that, it's not the other person's fault for making me feel bad. It's my responsibility to be able to overcome that. So now our sense of happiness is no longer in the hands of somebody else. We're not giving it to anybody else. We're saying that, I have control over this experience. It's my responsibility to overcome it. I shouldn't wait for other people to change. I shouldn't wait for the situation to change. I can change it here and now by my own ability. And I think that's a very strong and powerful message. And it's extremely relevant in today's society. And the instinct to want to protect those we love from these external sources of harm, to try and protect them and shield them from those situations and circumstances. It may be there because we don't like the people we love. We don't like seeing the people we love experience sorrow, but that's not a sustainable way to, try and overcome these issues. That really the change must come from within. And if that's the vision which we try and address the issue, I think we come up with a totally different realm of solutions. And I'll now pass it on to Parag, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I'm sure he has much more to share about this. So thank you. Hariom.
Hariom, and thank you, Shankarji. And so, yeah, bullying is an enormous topic. We could speak for hours. People write dissertations, they write books on discussing bullying. First of all, can you guys hear me okay? Thank you. What I want to do today is really kind of as Shankarji talked about, really get into understanding how recognition of bullying, and to do that we have to be able to understand what bullying is. So we can talk about definitions and where we see it, how we can turn that into part of our spiritual practice. It's really incorporating bullying into our spiritual life. And not in the sense of becoming bullies, but understanding bullies. And really kind of reflecting inside as to where sometimes we are the bully. So with that, just want to kind of jump into, I'll talk for a bit about definitions and about some of the science behind what people are talking about with bullying. But as we're doing this, I want to really I would request you all to really look at your own behavior, look at your own circumstances, and see where you can intervene in a positive way for others who are bullying, who are bullied, but also to look at where you may have been someone who harmed others and where a difference can be made. So we can just kind of jump right in. I'll talk for a little bit, and then as we're doing this, we'll discuss. Feel free to jump on in if you have any questions. And then at the end, we can all get together to talk more and answer some questions if you have any that come up. So I'll jump right in. All right, so can you guys see the screen okay, the beyond bullying? Okay, thank you. So like I said, there's a lot to talk about, and we're going to start off with an overview, but I wanted to actually get us to really start to feel the impact of bullying, and especially with children. What we're going to talk about is bullying in families, bullying, extending that to bullying in schools, extending that to bullying in the workplace, and then looking into what it's like to become the bully and to see that within ourselves, and then how we can intervene. So to start off with maybe a short video clip about bullying and the experience of it in kids. So if you have any issues with audio, let me know.
No, I don't know why. She's just no longer our friend.
Oh my god, she's so fat, she's so ugly, that bitch, that slut.
And she said, at least I'm not black.
It's because I have like baby hair, and since it's dark, that I look like a boy.
People used to call me fat, lazy, unworthy, stupid, faggot, gay.
It made me feel, just like they said, that I was worthless. I had no reason to live.
Then they made a chat about me, a chat on group message, just to talk about how much they hate me.
I just tried to keep deleting her, and I even blocked her a few times, and she just kept making accounts just to keep bullying me over the web.
Everything that I trusted them with was now public for everyone to see, for everyone to know. And I can't go in and delete it. I can't say this is spam, this isn't okay.
And I would cut my wrist, thinking that one day I'll have enough courage to split my vein. And it kept happening over and over again. Sometimes by different people or the same one.
They used to catch me at the gate and beat me up. Just wail on me, like 5 different kids, stomp on me, kick on me.
She held a pair of scissors against my neck and threatened to murder me. And in that moment, I thought I was gonna die.
I believe that bullying is a crime.
I have the courage
And I have the power to make a difference.
Instead of bringing people down,
We want to encourage
And empower
Everyone we meet,
With our words,
and with our actions.
Whether it's in person
Or online.
So any reactions? Oh, and I should say, if anything to say, please raise your hand, then I can unmute you. And take a second then to think about a situation that involved bullying in your own personal life. So we've heard some stories from some young kids. And as a psychiatrist, I get referrals and I talk to kids every day who've been going through these issues. It's pervasive in our society. We see it everywhere. But I want to bring it to the personal, bring it to yourself, and in your own mind, take a second to think about a situation where you experience bullying occurring, whether it's yourself being involved, or whether it's you're as a witness. Where are you in the scenario as it plays out in your mind? What are you feeling? What are you noticing occurring? What are some of the judgments that come to your mind as you see this scenario play out? What are there things that you want to do to the victim? Are there things that you want to do to the bully? So keep that in mind, and let's move forward to talk more about definitions. What is exactly the definition of bullying? Different than conflict. So we have conflict, which is inevitable. It's kind of part of human life, really from day one, where there's disagreements or where there's factions that don't see eye to eye. But bullying is something very specific, and at least in the literature, it's described as unwanted aggression that is repetitive or has the threat of being repetitive, and that involves a real or perceived power imbalance. And so unwanted meaning many different things. Could be making threats, could be verbal or physical. We often have the stereotype of bullying as kind of the physical thing, or you see two kids on the playground and one kid shoves the other and takes their lunch money. That certainly occurs, and so physical attacks certainly occur, but verbal attacks, exclusion, cyberbullying, it's aggression, whether it's passive aggression or whether it's full-on aggression that occurs, it's unwanted. It's repetitive, or it has the potential to be repetitive. And a bullying attack can happen once, but then if the person experiencing this is fearful or changes their behavior as a result, we consider that as part of bullying. And most importantly, it is related to the misuse of power. And this is something that, as we look into how our spiritual practice can be informed by understanding about bullying, we take into account where we notice where we don't have power, and we notice where we do. And what do we do, especially in situations when we have power? How do we use it? How do we misuse it? We often don't think about that. We often think about position, or we think about a situation where we have responsibility. To take the other person or the people that we have power over into consideration, we often decide not to think about that. We ignore it. One of the reasons is that in this culture, we often brush misuse of power under the rug. We fear that if we speak up, I'm sure you've heard the term "cinches get stitches." We fear retaliation, and we maintain power or power differentials oftentimes because we want to protect our own power. And so typically in bullying situations, you look at the difference between the bully and the one who's being bullied, and we often see differences in physical characteristics and popularity, socioeconomic status. Anywhere their difference can occur, you have a differential in power, and you have the potential for bullying to occur. Bullying occurs pretty much everywhere in human experience. And as we kind of go through this, we want to really start off at the family, where it often manifests first, to look at some of the characteristics of families that may lead to bullies or lead to individuals being bullied, extending out to school, to online, to the workplace, and pretty much through all of human experience. So we'll start with families. And what I want to do here is to get a sense of bullying as psychological needs that are unmet, whether that's the person being bullied or especially individuals who bully others. We often think of it in terms of judgment or punishment, but really speaking, it's being able to look at the situation of someone who's bullying compassionately as someone who has an unmet need, especially an unmet psychological need. And if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to stop and let me know. So let's think back to as infants up to the age of 5. What are some of the needs of that we've had when we were growing up at that age? Our first understanding of human relationships really comes from our family. You can imagine a baby that's born, they really don't have any models for understanding human relationships. They really don't understand how they're expected to be treated by others. Really speaking, small infants don't really understand the difference between themselves and others. They see, say, their mother as an extension of themselves. And as they get older, they begin to understand that there's a difference between myself and other people, and that there's a relationship, there's a dyad that occurs. What small children often do is, and ourselves as well, we take in unconsciously patterns that we see from our parents. And so thinking about how, as parents, and many of us are parents in the CSK group, how do we handle stress? How do we handle conflict? How do we show love? Small children take these into consideration. They actually internalize these into their own models. When children are met with fear and unable to share their feelings, or are met with distress, they really can't oftentimes express that. Especially young children don't have the verbal capacity to. They really don't. They can't speak, and so these feelings get internalized, and it often comes about as shame, as guilt, and you can imagine a small baby feeling those sort of feelings, or small toddler or young child. It leads to the point of they don't feel okay to be themselves, that there's something wrong with them. And there's often two ways that this gets manifested. It can lead to internalizing behaviors. We call, shutting down, fantasy, being caught in daydreaming, kind of disconnecting from life. And oftentimes those individuals are targets of bullies because they can be seen as weaker, they can be seen as shy or anxious, or it can be leading to externalizing behaviors. And so the pain, the suffering that's occurring gets turned outwards. And so oftentimes it can come out as aggression, anger. These are often kids that act aggressively or read situations that occur with an aggressive point of view. So in even a neutral situation that happens, they might read it as being aggressive and react in kind. Families, we typically think of families where bullying occurs, with abuse and neglect, and those are certainly, they happen, and very commonly. But even in families that you would, on the outside, look like any other family, there are a lot of behaviors that parents often project onto their children. And so, like I mentioned earlier, how adults who really don't process their emotions well, or who react in unhealthy ways, the child takes on those characteristics. I don't know if any of these terms sound familiar, but things like gaslighting. So a child basically reports their experience to a parent, and the parent dismisses it, denies that it's happening. You're imagining things. You're crazy. Black and white and generalization type thinking, where for example, a big one is all teenagers are moody. And so a teenager who's experiencing moodiness, they try to reach out to their parents, try to understand that emotion, and the parents dismiss it as, oh, all teenagers are moody. You're just a teenager. I'm sure we've heard that at times, or I'm sure maybe we've said that at times if we have teenagers. What that teaches the teen is that they're not an individual that we're going to pay attention to as a person, but they're just part of a general category. We're stereotyping them. What this leads to is a sense of invalidation and a sense that they're incomplete. And if this pattern gets repeated again and again and again, it can lead to someone either, again, going back to the idea of either internalizing and feeling that they're less than and feeling insecure, or externalizing and reading situations as being hostile or angry and unleashing that anger onto others when it isn't needed. Another way that families that can lead to bullying behaviors, both as the victim or as the bully, are comparison. And this is something that I think we see a lot in families, where families can gang up on each other, where multiple members of a family kind of show solidarity against another family member and then leaving that person out, or turning that person into a scapegoat. There's a concept of the golden child. Is this familiar to others? I'm sure you've kind of heard of that come up, where, say, in a family with two kids, one kid is the golden child, the one that's sort of given all the praise and all the possessions, while the other one is, semi-neglected. We can see how the person that's on the neglected side can suffer and feel inadequacy as a result. But also the golden child themselves suffers too. They can often get a sense of either entitlement or feel that they don't deserve what they're being given, and can feel a sense of inadequacy or a sense of imposter syndrome. Feel like they're faking it. And oftentimes parents make these decisions unconsciously. So they don't necessarily mean to separate. I mean, some parents certainly can be abusive like that, but it happens often under the surface. The children then internalize these patterns and then express these patterns elsewhere, whether it's school or as they grow up in the work environment and forward. Another one that often comes up is violation of boundaries, and this one is often subtle. When we think of sort of the parent's responsibility is to protect the child, to care for the child, but part of a responsibility of a parent is also allowing the child to learn on their own and make mistakes. And sometimes, in a 2-year-old, you want to make sure that you're watching them very carefully and making sure they're not going to fall down the stairs. But if a kid is 16 and you're doing those behaviors, you're really stunting their progress. And that leads to the child or the teen oftentimes feeling that there's something wrong with them, that they're inadequate somehow, because that's the message their parents are giving them, that we have to protect you more than other people because there's something wrong with you. So these are a few of many different types of traits that we tend to see in families where bullying occurs. There's many more, but what I want to do, the reason I'm bringing this up is to really begin to take a look at our own upbringing and especially as parents, how we're parenting our kids, and are we beginning to incorporate some of these patterns in our own behavior? Going back to the idea of the spiritual role, the first is introspection, really knowing what our behavior patterns are. It takes that sense of being able to look at ourselves critically and say, this is going to stop with me. This may have been the patterns that have occurred in previous generations, but it doesn't have to go any further from there. So the kid goes to school. They're 4 or 5 years old. They've been exposed to these patterns as a small child, going back to infancy. They're stepping into the larger realm, and they're meeting peers for the first time. They're dealing with other new power hierarchies, right? You have the teachers, you have the principal, you have the other staff members within the school. Within among the kids, you have the kindergartners versus the first graders versus the fifth graders, right? How does a child learn to navigate this, and what power differentials landmines can the child step into? Needs that small children from kindergarten age up until about the beginning of middle school, a main psychological need that we tend to see is the need to develop self-confidence. And often how kids begin to develop that is to try out new things and to gain some ability to master them. Often it starts off with sports, or it's music or other talents that they begin to recognize in themselves. It starts off with encouragement from teachers and from, say, Balvihar Sevaks and parents, really showing the child that they have the capability to be somebody in the future, that they have the capability to be somebody that has worth. And as we know, this doesn't always happen. And so, with criticism or bullying that occurs from siblings to, or parents or teachers, we tend to see children feel like they don't have autonomy at this age, and that leads to feelings of inferiority and guilt. This can, kind of like with the very small children, this can often lead to giving up and withdrawing, and often you see that in this age with academic withdrawal, where kids who previously were just really wanting to be good students, you start to see them start to decline. And it's usually third grade is where you tend to see this most often. Where you kind of go from the more the fun preschool, kindergarten, first grade activities to really learning. If kids struggle, they start to sort of give up, and this can also lead to anger. Where, for example, if a kid is feeling that they're less than, right, like they're not capable, and they see other kid that is capable in, say, a sport, they become jealous, and this is where jealousy often leads to bullying behaviors. Now the kid is going into later middle school, 13 into high school. And the psychological needs that you tend to see shift a bit from industry and inferiority, and learning about oneself and feeling competent and capable to really forming an identity. At this age, adolescents are really, 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 we all remember this, really, really concerned about how they appear for others, especially their peer group. And one of the tricky things about this age is that we'll take in what others say and try to incorporate that into our personality, or try to incorporate that into our identity. This isn't the healthiest behavior as we can imagine, especially looking at this from a Vedantic perspective. Who we are versus what we think we are very different. Who we are at the deepest level. But part of what the growing up process involves is sort of creating the ego, creating that sense of I am so-and-so, and because this person says I'm smart or this person says I'm an idiot, I start to incorporate that into my sense of self. Bullying at this age often is, in early childhood, it's often more physical. In this age, it's often more about criticism and isolation, and incorporating those messages of I'm not worthy or there's something wrong with me into my identity. And these scars often last for years. And so many times you'll talk to adults or even older individuals who they'll remember very well being bullied in their teenage years, and how the hurtful things that were said to them incorporated into their personality. It's very hard to remove that, and it takes a lot of sadhana. So about school bullying itself, it usually occurs in the school setting, often under the radar of adults. So usually not in the classroom per se, but typically bus, hallways, recess. If you watch any sort of TV shows about schools, this is where they're really good about identifying. This is where you often see it. It starts with social isolation, and it leads to taunts and oftentimes physical bullying. It can be perpetrated or supported by teachers and staff. And as people, again, in positions of power, especially in the CSK group, it's part of our role to really look for these situations occurring. We may or may not work in schools, but if in the workplace, wherever else we sort of are in positions of power, those who are in power can often be the ones who are perpetrating or allowing these things to happen because we don't pay attention. And then and we'll get into cyberbullying in a bit, but it's gone from being typically during the school day to pretty much 24/7. Very common in just terms of, I'll be really brief here in terms of frequency. In 2009 in high schools, it was about 1 out of 5 kids reported bullying in the last year. In middle schools, about 1 out of 3. However, more recent studies place that figure at 40%, which really indicates bullying is getting worse as a problem. And as a society, we recognize it, but we're maybe not doing much to solve it, unfortunately. Talk a little bit about just gender differences. Boys are often more typically bullied by other boys, whereas girls are typically bullied by a mix, about 50-50. Boys have more physical bullying versus in girls, you tend to see more rumor spreading, cyberbullying, and exclusion. And in particular in Asian American individuals, and this is something that was surprising to me, that in 2009, according to the DOJ, half of, and this is high school, Asian American children experience some sort of bullying. And this is the highest of any ethnic group. So the average back then was 20%. And at that time in high schools, among Asian American youth, it was 50%. In particular, cyberbullying is much more prevalent in the Asian American community. And so when we talk about bullying, especially looking at our friends, our nieces and nephews of Asian origin, we really need to start asking about cyberbullying as a factor. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but you think about the patterns that you tend to see and the unmet needs in childhood. We talked a lot about insecurity as being a big one. And so characteristics of children that are bullied frequently, and this is more just a survey of, what are some of the personality traits that you see? What do you read there? Anxiety, having fewer close friends, social isolation, a lot of fear that sort of rules one's life. And so as parents, and again, in the CSK group, a lot of us are parents or beginning to become parents, things to look out for. Children who are bullied won't often report that they're being bullied. There's a lot of guilt and shame associated with being a victim. And so they tend to keep this in themselves. And oftentimes the role of a parent or the role of a Balvihar Sevak, for example, is really to pay closer attention to what's under the surface. And so if you see these issues arise, right? Faking illness, I have stomach aches, I have headaches, what do? You take the child to the pediatrician, right? They'll run some tests, they'll try changing diet, or they might try a medicine to help, and nothing's working. Sudden decline in grades, what do parents often do in those situations? They yell at the kid, right? That's often the result. And as if the kid themselves is maybe reporting suffering relating to bullying, and they don't want to say it, but then what message do they get from the people around them that there's something wrong with them? Avoidance of social situations. We see this, one of the most common referrals to my practice is this, that kids are becoming more isolated. They don't want to have friends. They're scared to leave home, or they run away frequently. Oftentimes when you talk to them, the underlying issue is that they're being bullied. But this usually doesn't come out until you really get a sense of trust with the kid that they can finally open up about it. But as parents and as people in positions of power, it can be our role as part of our understanding of others to really pay close attention and to see if these issues arise, to think bullying is a possibility. In terms of frequency of different types of bullying, name calling, exclusion. I mean, it kind of crosses the gamut, but oftentimes name calling, exclusion are the most common. So I wanted to spread it out to looking at, we talked about the family, we talked about schools, and now we have this new factor, really in the last, say, 20 years, and really speaking social media in the past 15 years, that's kind of changed bullying entirely. It's turned it from being something that happens once in a while or in school settings in a limited place where kids can kind of compartmentalize and say, well, once I go home, I can be safe, to something that happens everywhere and follows them wherever they go. 92% of youth go online. This is 2009 data, so it's actually probably much more common now. And think about 15-year-olds have never lived in a world that Facebook didn't exist. Facebook was announced in 2004, which for many of us Setukaris is yesterday. But for kids growing up, this has been their life. Most kids, and this is older data, but actually 3/4 is probably obsolete now. Most kids have smartphones. If you go to any sort of middle school nowadays, or even elementary school, you'll see most kids have a smartphone and are on it quite frequently. What makes cyberbullying more pernicious, what makes it more dangerous, is anonymity and disinhibition that comes from that. When we wear a mask, oftentimes we as people do things we wouldn't do if they knew who we were. Nowadays, there are many closed networks, like Snapchat, for example, or Kik, where parents, teachers, police, they don't have access to those networks. And so you can send a snap to just a small group of people that disappears and nobody knows what happened, but the person that's being targeted does, and they can't prove that it occurred. I mentioned it's available 24/7. It's scalable, and this is something that we're seeing more and more of, where before in a bullying situation at school, you would imagine it might occur where you have one bully surrounded by 10 onlookers, and we'll get into sort of bystanders in a moment, but that's scalable now. The videos that are taken often go viral, and thousands, millions of people oftentimes have the ability to act as onlookers or witnesses to bullying, and you'll see that you can get, say a YouTube video gets posted about someone being bullied. The comments can be in the thousands, and they can be from all over the globe. And suddenly this child who's already struggling with insecurity is being bullied by somebody from Saudi Arabia or somewhere else randomly. It really leads to a sense of despair. And the last thing about cyberbullying that's different is that it lasts forever. And so postings, even if we delete them, sometimes they're stored in servers often for decades, potentially. They can follow you into the future. So common types of cyberbullying, a lot of this we know. A lot of this we may have even experienced ourselves. Two things I want to maybe focus on. One is doxing, and that's the giving out of personal information online. This is relatively new, and it can be very dangerous in the sense that it allows individuals that really want to harm a child to have very personal information. So stalking can occur, predation can occur. And the other is sexual bullying, which is becoming much more common, unfortunately. And we'll look at a little case scenario that talks about that in a second. So the government does have some general response, first aid for responding to cyberbullying. The first is so if this happens to you, if this happens to a loved one, what do you do? The first is don't respond, and don't forward it on to other people, but really start working as a detective on starting to collect evidence, taking screenshots, printing out texts and emails, noting dates and times, because all of this is going to be important in case it's taken to the police. Block the person that's bullying, which is often very difficult to do. In the previous slide, I mentioned pretending to be someone else online is a very common form of cyberbullying. So even if you were to block a bully, they can just make another account. You see this a lot on Instagram in particular. The Finsta, I'm sure you've heard of that term, where it's come up. The fake Instagram account is very commonly used to bully individuals. Reporting to law enforcement, reporting to the school, if you're in a work situation, reporting to HR, especially if there's information that can be used in a court case. Sexual bullying, for example, of minors is a crime. And it's important to kind of collect that data while blocking the individual, really disconnecting. One of the ways we tend to recommend kids proceed, at least in the short term, is to take a dopamine fast. And this is kind of maybe a hot term in Silicon Valley now, but the idea is to really disconnect from the online world. There's nothing online, and really speaking, that you need 100% connection all the time for. When you talk to kids about this, and actually if you talk to parents about this, they often look at me with just their mouth open of how could you even suggest something like that? But like any addiction, it's important to really first discontinue as much as possible, to detox off of the substance that causes that. And so one of the things we recommend is really kind of disconnect first completely. That also allows the child to really connect with the people that are around them that support them. It's easy to get lost into feeling completely stuck in the online world and all the rage and the shame that is associated with that. When you disconnect, you start to actually see the people that are there in real life that are supportive. Spreading a little bit further, so we talked about cyberbullying, and this gets into the workplace environment, because bullying occurs again across the spectrum. Bullying in the workplace environment is slightly different at times. It usually isn't physical. I mean, in some cases it can be, but I remember an incident that I'd heard of when I was in training, where a surgeon threw a scalpel at a nurse that they were angry at. But it's very uncommon. I mean, typically bullying is, well, first of all, it is very common in the workplace, but it typically is more emotional bullying that occurs, and misuse of power. In IT and healthcare, very common, especially. For companies, it contributes to workplace attrition and lower productivity pretty much across the board. And so companies have actually become recently very attuned to bullying. Depending on the survey, you're looking at an 80% to 90% or higher rate of experiencing some sort of bullying in the workplace, depending on the profession. In the medical field, for example, in nurses, in one study looking at 80%. In medical students, in the 4 years of medical training, 81% experience at least one episode of bullying, or what they consider as bullying. In IT, the numbers are similar. And so common themes that you see in the workplace that may be different perhaps than in the school or in the family. Passive aggressive communication. So this is replying all to emails to the entire company, especially ones that are critical or humiliating to somebody. Preventing promotions for individuals that deserve promotion, really just to sort of assert one's power over somebody else. Secret information is something we don't often talk about. Say you have in a company, you have two different groups, and one has the ability to help another innovate, but they keep the information secret so that they can self-sabotage the other group and look better. And also discouraging clients, kind of going behind someone's back to really kind of take away their livelihood. There are many other types of bullying in the workplace, but those are kind of common themes that come up when it's studied. Vivekji has a wonderful way of thinking about this. When he talks about bullying, he says, if this happens in the workplace, sometimes you can't avoid it. The power hierarchies are there. One thing to focus on if you're being mistreated is first what you can do to stop it, right? Who can you talk to? How can you assert yourself? If that is not possible, but you don't want to leave, focus on the contribution that you can make to really kind of find a sense of what is your purpose being there in that workplace? What is your role? What are you there for that you can serve others? And focusing just on that, and let all the other external noise just be the external noise. So I always found that very helpful when he was talking about that. So interventions, kind of going forward, I know I want to be mindful of time. So we'll do a quick case study, and this is one involving a child. I'll just briefly summarize. Sonia's in 10th grade. She's a strong student. There's a group of girls that don't like her though, and they say terrible things about her. Others mean to her. And so one day, Sonia is in the gym class and she's changing in the locker room, and Lisa, one of the bullies, takes pictures of her undressing. By the end of the day, those are shared on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Kids are giving Sonia high fives. They're sneering at her. She's getting all these reactions. When she comes home, she sees comments associated with the pictures in the thousands. She comes to you in tears. You're her parent. What do you do? So take a second to think about that. And this is actually a common scenario. I've taken this from many different stories that I've heard in my practice over the years and kind of combined them, but this happens a lot. So as a parent, what would you say? How would you intervene? So take a second just to kind of think about that. So thinking about interventions, there's the short-term sort of debriefing, what happens in the moment, and then there's the building of resilience for the individual being bullied. And so we'll kind of talk about that in a stepwise fashion. The first thing you do as a parent, so Sonia comes to you, she's in tears. Check yourself first. Watch your own emotional reaction, because that is going to be something that she's going to be paying very close attention to. And how you react is how she's going to prejudge how you feel about the situation. She herself is already feeling a lot of blame and a lot of guilt about this. She feels shame. And as a parent, if you come across as judgmental or harsh, it's just going to confirm to her that the shame is deserved, that there is truly something wrong with her, that she deserved the attack. Ask about what happened, and then ask the person who they feel is responsible. And this is often a time when you might get a sense of they believe that they're the ones responsible. They believe that it's their fault. And you can begin to kind of have the conversation about, no, this is not your fault. You don't have to feel shame about this. This is something that happened to you. Allow them to, or reinforce, I should say, the right to tell, and demonstrate that you are willing to protect them, that you're going to be there to listen. And then focus on listening to the underlying needs and requests. This is what we call active listening. And so oftentimes when you're dealing with these situations, you have a rush to talk back or to try to console or to try to, you're kind of thinking about what to say while they're telling their story. Take a second, be present first. Allow them to sort of express themselves, allow them to be, and then read between the lines. What is it they need from you at that moment? That attunement, and let's go back to early childhood, that attunement is what a bullied child or a child who's mistreated as an infant is missing from their parent. A careful parent will be present with the child, will be attuned to their needs in the moment as someone's being bullied, no matter what their age. And this could be a coworker coming up to you and expressing this happened to them. Take that role of being attuned to that individual. The power of it is incredible. Focus on then, next step is, again, within primary intervention, how they can be safe. If you need to intervene with the school, if you need to intervene with HR, if you need to intervene with the police, help them and really kind of take the responsibility in doing that. Something we don't tend to recommend is to try to get the kids to talk to each other at the moment. The idea is to really kind of focus on the person being bullied first. And then one of the key ways that our own spiritual practice informs this is that this is our chance, or one of the chances, I should say, to model that respectful and compassionate behavior. To really sort of be a guide for the bullied individual, but also the ones who are bystanders as well as the bully themselves, but how we should act in a situation where there's a difficult problem. How to be compassionate even among people you disagree with. This is the chance to really apply our skills that we're learning as students of Vedanta. Kind of going forward, the next step, and this is a much more long-term step, we sort of start with the emergency management and safety. The next step is really getting a sense of developing resilience. And in my practice, we often talk with kids about the example of a soldier, someone who kind of goes into a situation where they potentially could be harmed. What is it about that soldier that allows them to walk into the battlefield? Even though there may be the enemy shooting bullets at them, they're in danger, and we can't deny that they're in danger, but yeah, they go forward. And if that's battlefield for that individual, for the child is school, or if it's, say a workplace environment or a family, what is it that allows that soldier to step into that battlefield? Typically it's training is the first step, right? They know what to do in the moment. They feel like they've been trained appropriately. And the second is meaning. And this is one that we often take a much longer time to talk about and to build. So first off, with training, right, we teach children to identify body sensations, identify feelings, experience what's happening in the moment. Mindfulness practice is very helpful for this because it allows the child to sort of get a sense of what's occurring, what triggers lead to those emotions and feelings. And we set up with them, and as parents or as teachers, we can work with this. We set up with them an if-then series of statements. If I feel unsafe, if I see this bully in the hallway, if I have a meeting with this other person in my company, what do I do next? How do I cope in the moment? How do I keep myself centered? This is different for each person, but really the conversation can occur around what do I do to allow myself to feel safe? And the important thing as parents especially is to practice this with kids. Our lives get so busy, we're kind of caught up in doing every other thing, but part of military training, for example, is drills, right? Of doing the same thing over and over and over again until it becomes automatic. I would almost look at this with a child who's being bullied or a coworker, drill with them about what can I do to sort of in the moment as the bullying occurs or as I feel unsafe, what do I do? We help identify the team, who is going to be able to help that person. Who are the people around that, whether it's friends, whether it's coaches, whether it's Balvihar students, whether it's Swami, whoever it may be, people around that individual who can be sources of support, sources of wisdom. Once that's done, once the training is done, then we start to focus on meaning. And this is where our spiritual practice can really inform our work. We try to help the person understand what is a positive connection and how to sort of forge positive connections with others, how to find oneness with others. We work on development of wisdom. And this is a process that is a lifelong process, but as parents, we can model this in the home setting, or as teachers or just adults in the world. Our demonstrating this through our own sadhana is a model for students to help them develop meaning. Right? That soldier walks into that battle knowing I'm serving my country. They have a purpose behind that. What is the purpose for that child to walk into that school that day instead of refuse? What is the purpose in that moment? Cultivating that is the next step, and that step can take a long time. Lastly, and this is more sort of big picture, focusing on the social climate. Bullying doesn't happen in a vacuum. The culture of a given organization, whether it's a school or whether it's a nation, encourages, for whatever reason, the bullying to occur. And so the next step after you've helped the individual is to really expand and help the society or help the organization. How can we sort of build connections with each other? How can we learn about bullying and effective management of conflict? We often talk about anti-bullying programs, and I won't dwell too much on this, but the research is not that great, unfortunately. And so this is a place where, as you talk about students of Vedanta, the science is demonstrating that the current methods in psychology perhaps are lacking in some ways. The best programs have about a 12% reduction in bullying per year in school. Many other programs that are tried have a 0% improvement, and actually some show that they might actually cause bullying to get worse. And so as this is a place where there's perhaps a bit of a black hole in scientific literature, and this is where a place where our own understanding of Vedanta can really be helpful and can really kind of take the lead, because kind of going beyond what the science says at the moment. So moving on, we talked about bullying, we talked about places where it may occur. I wanted to kind of discuss about, as Shankarji had mentioned earlier, beginning to find compassion for the individuals who engage in bullying. Most often they're met with anger, they're met with judgment, they're met with punishment. But if we think back to where the bullying came from, it's often unmet needs. It often started in situations that they had no control over. Right? They didn't choose necessarily their parents, or they didn't choose the adverse experiences they had to deal with as kids in their development, they didn't choose to have their own needs not met. And so in our working with individuals who have harmed others, one of the first steps that we can take is to work on our own compassion towards them, to work on our own judgments. Otherwise, it's hard to go any further. So seeing bullying as a learned behavior, and one of the ways that we tend to look at this psychologically is the root of bullying is fear. We often think of bullying in terms of anger and rage, but really what are anger and rage but the outward expressions of internal fear, of internal anxiety. And so a situation occurs in order to feel safe, the child or the person engages in aggression towards others or demonstrating that they're powerful in whatever misguided way. They're trying to avoid that pain of feeling inadequate. And that is often that step of anxiety to safety seeking and avoidance to eventually trying to control others and then seeking power. If that gets repeated again and again and again, if that's modeled from the culture, that becomes how that person operates. And so when we deal with individuals, and especially as we look at ourselves in ways that we've hurt others, it's important to look at that and say, my response to someone who's being a bully is first going to be a sense of trying to understand where they're coming from, trying to be compassionate as to why it is that they learned this particular behavior. Kind of in the interest of time, I'll kind of move forward just in terms of chronic bullying. Empathy is there in bullies, and this is kind of newer information scientifically. We often think of bullies as lacking empathy. It isn't actually the case. Bullies often have a great deal of empathy, and whenever we harm others, we hope to think that we have empathy. But it's the creativity is often in the pursuit of power, where the creative energy that we have in a bullying situation is used to our own selfish ends. And that's where it turns into bullying versus, even if we may have empathy for a situation, they're using our creativity as a service, as a way to reverse this. The other thing to think about when you think of bullying is when you study bullies as kids and follow them throughout the lifespan, lives are often very challenging. And so we look at adults around us and often have judgments. We kind of walk down the street in the city and see individuals who are, say, homeless or engaged in criminal behavior or drug abuse. One of the things that comes to mind often is judgment, but many of those individuals may have experienced these experienced adverse childhood experiences that led to bullying, and that can help us look at them in a different way, hopefully a more compassionate way. So what can I do? First and foremost, remember that bullies they're doing the best that they can. They just haven't had the good models that perhaps we have, or perhaps they ought to have, to really connect with others. And they find that through anger and fear, they had gotten what they wanted in the past, and they're just using that same model again and again and again, even though it's really causing harm. Very important to work with bullies on establishing positive peer connections as much as possible. In a workplace, that would be kind of introducing them to people that might kind of be able to forge a sense of community, to avoid judgments, but also not to say that they shouldn't be any consequences to bullying. And this is often misinterpreted as that. You can be compassionate, but still set limits. And then for ourselves, and this is where the sadhana really becomes important, to model the positive interactions with others, to really work on how we deal with stress, to demonstrate that to the individuals who are bullies. And I'll kind of move forward with this quickly, but one of the ways that's often used in the psychological sphere to deal with bullying is social emotional learning. It's really kind of teaching the skills of changing aggressive patterns of behavior into assertive patterns of behavior. How to sort of get what you want or ask what you want from others without needing to rely on aggression. One of the key factors in this is one, maintaining self-control, which is often difficult for us on a regular basis, but also to really work with a sense of gratitude and to use that gratitude to see the gifts that we've been given as a first step prior to trying to ask others. It changes the tenor of the conversation quite a bit. Last, I wanted to kind of talk about our role as, whether we're witnesses or bystanders, what can we do and how can we apply our own spiritual growth to situations where we witness bullying. So what stops us from acting? Typical bullying scenario, and this is a pretty well established in the literature of just the different roles that people take in a given bullying scenario. This is usually studied in kids, but it applies in various scenarios. In the center, you have the bully, the children that are bullied, and A are the actual individuals committing the bullying. B are the henchmen. So they kind of take part, they sort of are monitoring and helping the bully out. Then you have the supporters, the ones that are sort of cheering them on. That's where if say a fight in a schoolroom, you have all the kids around them cheering, egging on the fight. But there are a number of other roles that people take. Passive supporters, those that are watching but not really engaging in it. Onlookers that say none of my business and just kind of observing. Knowing the potential witnesses who know that they should help but don't. And then the ones that I want to sort of highlight and to really sort of work towards becoming are the ones that really resist and stand out and really speak up. This is where the courage to actually use our sadhana, to apply what we've learned in real world scenarios is needed. In the interest of time, I'll skip over the case, but I want to kind of touch base on, there's an interesting case that sort of sparked this understanding in the literature in psychology, which is the Kitty Genovese case. And you may have heard of this. Interestingly, in recent years, it seems like the details of the case are probably not as solid as we used to think. But basically, there was this young lady that was stabbed to death on her front door at her apartment in New York City in 1964. And there were 58 people who were witnesses. Either they heard her screaming, they were in apartments nearby, they were on the street, or they directly watched the murder occur. Nobody called 911. Nobody intervened. It just occurred completely. The bystanders just kind of observed what happened and just turned the other way. And this really prompted an investigation as to why this might be. So it's been called the bystander effect. When there are a lot of people witnessing a difficult situation, we all think someone will help. And if everyone thinks someone else will help, then nobody helps. And that's what happened in this scenario. We often think ambiguity and consequences. We're not sure what we should do. And so we fear repercussions in case we do act. And we often tend to help more in cases we actually do help when the victims are similar to us. If they're different from us, it's very easy. And most humans, we tend to say, well, it's not my problem. And we move on. Part of our sadhana is really expressing and really embodying the courage to be the people that can make a difference, to actually stand up. And so to conclude, turning bystanders to upstanders. So being the people that, as part of our spiritual practice, we're not going to turn away. We're not going to be the bystanders. First and foremost, we're going to look in our own minds and our own hearts and see where we've harmed others and what patterns may have led to that. If we witness bullying happening, not turning away, we're going to start to pay attention. We're going to be the people that show support. To the bully, to the people that are harming, we're going to be able to approach them with a sense of curiosity. Not judgment, not hatred, not malice, but really just sort of beginning to question in a Socratic way where the bully is coming from, what motivates their actions, often using humor, changing the subject, kind of diffusing the situation. Unlike the people in the Kitty Genovese case, we'll actually call the police if the police are needed, right? Or we'll call HR or wherever it may be. We'll talk to the teachers. We'll kind of get other people involved and say that there's something happening here that needs to be addressed. Please help me address it. And perhaps most importantly, we'll connect to those who are victimized. We'll reach out to them, let them know that they have intrinsic worth. Let them know that people care. This can be our way of really demonstrating that they have worth and that the way that they view themselves through shame, through guilt, through all the patterns that they've generated from the experiences in the past doesn't have to be the way that they go forward. And so with that, this is where we go beyond bullying. We sort of not allow ourselves to be bystanders, not allow ourselves to just let the bullying continue in whatever medium it occurs, but to really take that step of saying, it stops here. And this is going to be part of my spiritual practice, that I'm going to ensure that I'm courageous enough to start taking these steps. So in summation, we kind of talked about definitions. We talked about where it is in society. First step interventions for those being bullied. Then later step, building resilience, talking about the bullies themselves and understanding it as a learned behavior and how compassion can be applied. And then finally, turning bystanders and upstanders. There are many resources out there. StopBullying.org is actually a really good one. This is from the US government. Actually, it's stopbullying.gov. That's a typo there. The American Academy of Pediatrics, UNICEF has a whole program on bullying that can apply to work organizations, especially to schools as well. The idea is to kind of keep the conversation going. Let me exit out of here. I do apologize for the time, but I wanted to see if any questions.
Sorry, so Parag, before we start with the questions, I think Pooja had a few announcements to make, so we can just do that, and then maybe we'll stay on for about 10 more minutes. If people have questions, they can do that. If people have to leave, they can leave as well. So Pooja, I'm just gonna unmute you.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. Yeah, just thanks again, Parag, for sharing your insight. Very, very eye-opening, and thanks for spending the time to talk to us. Just a couple of quick announcements around CSK and upcoming events. And then if folks need to leave, that's totally fine. Parag will stay on a little bit longer for Q&A. So Kanchan is putting in the chat right now a couple of resources. One, we have a really active WhatsApp group for evolving adults, young adults. We talk a lot about these topics, interesting articles people are reading, just things that they're pondering and introspecting about. So please join that WhatsApp group. There's also a Facebook group she's linking with announcements. There's a couple of other events happening simultaneously. There's a monthly workshop on media that's linked, led by Vivekji. And then there is an upcoming Chinmaya Setukari retreat. It's for evolving adults, March 13th to 15th in Seattle. So please check out the information for that retreat. It's linked. And then there's a new virtual Jnana Yagna happening March 29th to April 1st. It's 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern on the topic of magical mantras. And this is kind of the part 2 of I think the series that had happened before. So more information linked. So please join the many other activities, and we'll be having another wellness workshop likely next month. So more information about that will be on our Facebook group and our email listserv, etc. But I will hand it over. I guess if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. Kanchan will unmute you, and then Parag can answer it. But for everyone, thank you so much for joining us. And if you'd like to stay on another 10 minutes for Q&A, feel free to.
It'd be best if you can raise your hands virtually. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a participant option. If you click on that, you'll see it'll open up a new screen, and on the side, you would see an option to raise your hand. So if you do that, then I can unmute you. Otherwise, you're just going to go through screens.
What is a way to maybe, if you're observing someone getting bullied, whether it's behind their back or whatever it is at work or other places, what's a way that you can, bring it to their attention? Because I think certain HR policies wouldn't necessarily let me go and bring it to somebody's attention because it doesn't directly affect me, I guess. But what's a way to bring it up to somebody else without, I don't know. Is there a way to bring it up to somebody else that this is the subject of the bullying but may not know about it?
So one technique that can be helpful is Socratic questioning. Can you guys hear me okay? So being able to really just ask general questions about that person's experience. So first is to kind of establish that connection, really get to know that person as an individual, and gradually get them to kind of talk about what their experience is in that company, say it's a workplace situation. How do they feel about being there? And really kind of get them through your questioning and kind of just being very open-ended and very connected to them, get them to begin to sort of look at their own experience. You're right, oftentimes individuals that are bullied don't know that they're being bullied. They feel like they're stressed and they don't know why they're being stressed. So beginning to kind of open up that conversation in case you can't directly tell them. In most HR policies, I would imagine at least has some leeway there. So it'd be good to kind of find out from your company what the actual policy states, because you should be able to at least have some conversation about that, or bring it up to a supervisor perhaps. Really, the main way to, in a situation, whether it's a company or whether it's a child, is first get to know the person, really kind of get that connection, and then allow them the space to be able to help introspect for themselves. And they might find there's a lot going on that they may not even realize.
Hi, Parag. This is Malaka Kashyap. I'm actually a 7th, 8th grade teacher at Balvihar Badri. So I got this information and I found it that it would be interesting for me because kids are of the age that are experiencing this. And I am not from, I haven't grown up here and stuff. So I'm trying to see how I can relate to them and try to understand them. I talk to my kids who are now in college, but they say they didn't experience that much, or it was very little. But so my question here is, in class, in Bal Vihar, how can I help them open up? There are some children who are very, they seek a lot of attention. They do disturb the class. And at that age, I do understand that it's just more than that. So is it some underlying issue that they're facing, That's one. And my second question is, our generation and the generation of parents whose kids are in 7th, 8th grade, I know that our Indian parents are, they push the children a lot and very competitive and comparing. I know many of the parents in my age group, I don't know how much, I might have done it too. I confess, but yeah, and then, so I think that, and I've been reading a lot about narcissism, it's been going on a lot. So I feel that these things are all related. I feel a lot of us as parents are very narcissistic towards our kids, which could be the cause of them being insecure or whatever, but how can I help?
Well, the first step is what you're doing, which is to begin to recognize that an issue is there. Patterns that we all sort of have moments. I can certainly speak for myself. We all have moments where we act in a narcissistic way, or we try to control others, or we have judgments, or we compare. This is human nature. I think that we all sort of do this at any given day. So to say that this wouldn't happen, I think, is asking too much. So the first is to introspect. And exactly what you're saying right now is to say, well, to ask that question, how is it that I'm engaging in a way that could be harmful, or how can I do better? Asking that question is primary. And then once you start to see those patterns, what can I do to stop those patterns now? Just because it's not so much the pattern occurring that's the issue, it's the pattern being repeated that's the problem. So the longer that, say, comparison, for example, in a family, it'll happen. Every family has got, siblings are going to be compared against each other. Even if it's not by the parent, it could be by an uncle or a grandparent or somebody else. So it's going to happen. Does it happen on a regular basis? If it does happen, am I going to consciously step in to say, no, this isn't how I want to see this? How do we sort of stop patterns from becoming repetitive? Because it's in the repetition that's often where the harm occurs. And to your first question about, as a Bal Vihar Seva, where can we begin to open up, help kids open up? First and foremost, to really have content that we talk about in Bal Vihar that the kids feel relevant, and that is relevant, that they can really kind of connect to. Because kids love to talk about themselves. And I think we all love to talk about ourselves. I think there's a sense of, maybe that is narcissism to some degree, but once you kind of allow them to feel that they can connect to the material, you'll see even often some of the shyer kids begin to open up. If you're not seeing that happen, then definitely talk to them privately. When I was doing more Bal Vihar teaching, this happened a few times where there was a kid who I knew had a lot to say, but whether it was the group around them that was being too loud or obnoxious, or they just felt uncomfortable. If you take them aside and kind of sit back and say, yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on what we were talking about. They'll begin to open up. And once they feel comfortable opening up to you, then they might start opening up in the
Hariom Parag, thank you so much for this awesome talk. So in what you were saying, you were talking about specifically in school age settings between the ages of 5 and 12, that's the key time to developing self-confidence. And in thinking about even being more preventative or kind of on the opposite end of bullying, but rather trying to create more self-esteem and self-awareness and confidence. Do you have any suggestions in terms of, especially with that age group, how to develop self-confidence?
It can be a challenge, especially since a lot of times kids will get messages, whether it's from the teachers, whether it's from the larger society, that they are inadequate. For example, you think about advertising, right? Every advertisement you see, and kids nowadays are experiencing hundreds of advertisements a day, especially as they spend so much time online. Every advertisement that you see depends on a feeling of inadequacy to be effective. And so pretty much if adequacy and a sense of competence is one of the main psychological needs from the age 5 to 12, everywhere they go, they're going to get the message that they're not. And so, one of the ways to help is first to have them recognize that fact. And really kind of start, and I like using advertisement as an example just because it's something that it's kind of neutral, and you can talk to the kid, watch a YouTube video, watch the ad for whatever, skin cream or something that comes up, and then let's talk about how they're trying to make you feel inadequate. And then let's extend that to, now at school, your teacher said, so-and-so got an A and you got a B, and how does that make you feel? Does it make you feel like that skin cream ad made you feel? And now we talked about how the skin cream ad there's an agenda behind it, or now what could the teacher's agenda be? Could it be, the teacher means well, but they're just not coming at it in the right way. You're starting to help that child look at situations where they may feel inadequate and really look at the situation beyond the first impulse that comes up. And so it takes a lot of coaching and a lot of beginning to sort of look at the world in a different way. But once they start to do that, then they see it everywhere. And that helps them realize that the messages that they're getting, that they are inadequate, there's some agenda behind it, or there's some motive that's behind it that isn't necessarily attuned to them. Hopefully that's helpful. The other thing I tend to recommend is martial arts or some other activity where they can really kind of get a sense of mastery by practice. If they can, or, speech team is a great one, or for the middle schoolers especially, sports, other places where they can really feel like practicing piano, just other activities where they can, by repetition, by practice, that they see themselves improving. That's at least one example in their life where they are able to make a change and demonstrate that they are capable of change. And they can begin to extend that to other aspects of their life over time.
Madhav.
Hariom Parag, it's Madhav.
Hariom.
Hariom. I just have a question. I know you mentioned that there were some school interventions that were very minimally successful. So you said something like 13%, and some actually had like a negative, impact on school environments. Like you were talking about like social interventions, right? Like systemic interventions. Are you aware of what differentiates some of the more successful ones from the ones that are not so successful?
To some degree. So the ones that are really not successful are zero tolerance policies. So I think one of the characteristics that you see in unsuccessful interventions is where the person being victimized either feels increasing fear or feels blame. So in a zero tolerance situation, what that means is basically if a bullying event happens, then both the bully and the victim are punished. There's nuances to that, but that's kind of the general view. And as you can imagine, the person is being victimized, and on top of that, then they feel that they're going to be punished, and so they're basically not going to say anything. And so you end up seeing, initially when zero tolerance was rolled out, you saw a reduction in bullying, reporting. So initially they thought, this is great, this is actually working really well. We have an intervention that works fantastic. But then when you test it out, it's because the reporting dropped because the kids felt scared to say anything. And they felt that they were being invalidated, basically. So a feeling of invalidation, a feeling of further victimization usually means a negative scenario. Another one is mediation, which again is one of those where on the surface it might make sense, but when you actually test it out, it doesn't work, or it doesn't work that well. We think of it, say, in a divorce, right? You two parties that are in severe conflict, they go to mediation, they kind of talk their issues out, and oftentimes it works well. So in adults, mediation actually can be helpful, but in kids, you have a bully and someone bullying them sitting in the same room together, and having someone kind of talk about their feelings. If expertly done, it could work, but it really takes expert level mediation for it to be successful, because typically what will happen is the kid being bullied will sit there in abject fear about what's going to happen or about what retaliation is going to come to them next, and so they're not going to say anything. And the bully is just going to pretend like things are, we're healed, but then, the minute that the teacher leaves, then it's going to go back to the same scenario. Situations that work really well, so interventions that work at least, well, meaning the 12 percenters, the ones that actually have some positive benefit, really work on changing the culture. And it's not just a one-time kind of intervention where you have a big assembly and everybody sits down and they talk about bullying and then that's it, because that probably isn't going to do much at all. If you ask the students a week later, did they actually learn anything, or what did they learn? They probably would tell you maybe one or two sort of generic pointers. But really working on changing the culture through developing social emotional skills, how to handle conflict, how to turn aggression into assertiveness, really sort of training that and making that part of the curriculum, that does seem to have some benefit. Modest benefit, but some benefit.
Ricky?
Hariom, Parag, thank you very much for your talk. I have a slightly different question. We always think about bullying for children, but I wanted to talk for different generations. So bullying in families where a senior person over the age of 65 is being bullied. Now, this is almost a very sensitive matter because they've maybe lost a bit of the self-confidence, the ability to really sit down and talk and even understand the fact that they are being bullied. So what would your suggestion be in that case? Is it better to talk to the person who's being bullied or the person who's bullying them? And secondly, what are the psychological needs of somebody who's over 65?
Oh, great question. So I'll start with the second question. Oftentimes at that age, as you get into the sort of twilight years, a really successful individual psychologically will be able to look back on their life and realize that they had generated a net benefit for them having been there, for having been alive. So for example, someone in the vanaprastha stage of life, they'll be able to look at their kids and their grandkids, and we look at the, whatever business they set up or whatever they had started, and they'll be able to say the world was better because I was able to help facilitate, by whatever grace I received, I was able to help facilitate this. That my grandkids are well behaved, or they're wise. My children are wise because I was able to, the best of my ability, teach them in a way that was making things better. And so that's a critical need at that age. Being able to look back and to see that one had some sort of positive impact. And then the other one, as you get, especially in the older years, is to look at death and to be able to get to a point where one can welcome it. And of course, this is very difficult. To even talk about it is a challenge. But to look at death as, and to really sort of examine one's feelings about death. And so we often think of the vanaprastha stage, and looking at it from a Vedantic perspective, we look back, we sort of withdraw from the world, but hopefully withdrawing from our grihastha stage in a way that had made the world at least somewhat better through our having been through it. And then as we face death, we look at eternity and stepping into the sannyas stage of renunciation of this body. And so those are kind of the psychological needs, both from the Western and the Eastern perspective, in the Vedantic perspective. To the first question about elder bullying, we didn't even get into this at all, but it's an extremely important topic. It happens a lot, for one. The rates are really, really high. Whether that's from the children bullying the elders, whether that's, say, in a nursing home, abuse of elders in nursing home. Financial abuse is very common as well. So kind of really people trying to collect someone's life savings through basically fraud. As much as possible, try to talk to the individual being bullied first. Kind of like you would with another individual being bullied, really kind of to connect with them and to become someone that they can trust. Say with dementia, it becomes very difficult though. That person may not be able, cognitively may not be able to really meet you there. You can talk to the individuals that are, perpetuating this. If they're open, they might be able to kind of look at themselves more introspectively. But if they're not, it really is, you need to intervene through elder services, really kind of taking more of a legal approach. And putting it in the hands of those who are more trained to do that sort of work, to really kind of help extricate that person from that situation. Every state and province, as I know, has elder protection services, kind of like you'd see with children with DCF, the Children and Family Services. There's the department that works with elders being abused. And so really, if you can't reach the individual because of, say, their cognitive state, if the people that are doing the abuse are unreachable, or if they don't have that relationship with you, then really contacting higher authorities there.
Hello, Paragji. Thank you so much. This was really good, and especially our kid is in primary school, elementary school, and so my question is, at this age we haven't seen any such symptoms, but we do see some feedbacks from him. So how we can, and I know this is going to come in middle school and high school. So how we can prepare our kids for these issues beforehand, before they face it? Is there anything like priming we can do, or talk with them, or anything we can do so that they are aware that this is happening in the school, and they should be ready for that?
Definitely. So I mean, really talking to them about what may happen, really to kind of get them the skills. I think this is the most important thing you can do, is really work with them on getting the skills on how to handle if others are treating them unfairly or if they feel hurt. Oftentimes that leads to an emotional reaction, and they get really upset or angry and kind of act out. Really kind of working on how they can remain calm, how they can reach out to others that can help them. Really kind of learning the skills and being able to cope with difficult situations is helpful. You can't often predict what the situation might be. You can kind of let them know that common ones are, being teased or being excluded, or physical bullying. So you kind of let them know what may happen, but really it's whatever negative situation arises, do I have the skills to cope with that? One of the big ways that families can really help is really, how do you cope with stress? If, say, you're at work and your coworker says something mean, how do you deal with that? Being very open and honest with the kid about how you do it really teaches them how they can do it, because they have a role model in you. So being that role model, showing them really kind of step by step how you handle difficult situations, gives them the skills to be able to cope with it when they arise. So hopefully that's answering your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Parag, there's a question by Shilpa Rao, but I think she left the session. But if you do want to address it for everyone else, there was a question in the chat group.
Let's see. So many people in the group have shared bullying experiences in their child and adolescent years. Any suggestions on how people can heal and process their experiences so that they can be present and attuned to their children without bringing their baggage? So for one, again, asking the question is the most important thing. Being able to begin to look at oneself and see what's one's motives in interacting with a child. So taking the example of comparison. I mentioned that's often how in families bullying gets, in families that otherwise look very intact and very healthy, how bullying can occur. So when you notice the impulse, knowing that's a possibility, when you notice the impulse to compare, my daughter got an A, but my son got a B, thinking, what is my motive behind that? Especially, what is my motive behind sharing that information with them? Why should I tell my son, well, your sister got an A? Do I want them to do better? Is that where I'm coming from? Do I want them to be a better student, for example? It's actually a very noble motive. There's nothing wrong with that. But how can I do that without using comparison? Right? There may be other ways to work with that. To really ask your son, oh, you know, you got a B. I'm glad you studied. You know, what can we do to keep working and keep doing better? And not even mentioning the sister at all could be a different approach. So what is the motive behind why we're engaging in that action? Whether, you know, comparison is just one example, but in other ways that we tend to see that, you know, see even with discipline, right? You know, oftentimes, especially coming from, you know, in India, you know, I think spanking, for example, is very commonly used. And we try in pretty much every place that's been studied, it seems like it isn't all that effective in the long run. Probably not worth continuing, but we have the impulse to that occurs, right? This child did something wrong and I need to discipline them. Then asking the question, how can I do it in a way that isn't going to be detrimental to the child? That isn't just going to sort of model, well, if someone does something wrong, I'm going to hit them and they're going to stop. How can I give that same message, which is a noble message to give, but by a means that won't cause further harm? So simply asking that question is how we can begin to peel and sort of process. The second part is really talking to others, sharing experiences with other parents, sharing experiences, especially in a spiritual environment. With access to an acharya or a swami, begin to sort of discuss that and how can I incorporate my spiritual practice into my parenting. That's the other way to work with it.
Hi, I'm Parag. This is Nikhil. Quick question following up on just this conversation. So I come from a perspective of being a Bhavihar teacher more so than a parent. So my question is, you'll have kids in a classroom setting that succeed, that do very well, that are golden children, do very well. Then you have other children that aren't as cooperative or just don't do as well. Is there a way that you can recognize those kids that are doing well without putting the kids down? Showing the kid, let's say one kid does very well and is able to recite the story very well and knows all the details. Is there a way to, show that kid's doing really well without making everyone else feel inferior and that they're not doing as well?
Well, it is important to offer praise. Kind of going back to maybe some of the earlier slides talking about needs and competency in developing that. And part of that is done through praise. So it's okay to say, you know, oh, you chanted this very well. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's helpful. I mean, really, I think would be sort of talking to the class about what the expectation is for everybody and sort of setting a baseline to say, you know, as part of members of this class, we need to be able to chant, you know, the first 5 shlokas in the Gita for this, you know, whatever chapter we're doing right now. This is the expectation that we have for everybody, and everybody in this room is capable of meeting that expectation. So setting that expectation just kind of flat across, and there will be some that excel. They may know 20 verses just like that, but and it's okay to praise that and say, this is wonderful. I'm so glad that you're taking this initiative. But saying for everybody, this is what the expectation is, and you are all capable of meeting this, that I have trust that you are able to do this. I think that's the message that helps prevent the golden child syndrome.
I think we're good. There's no more questions. So thank you everyone for staying longer.